Hello, and welcome to Progressive Christianity 101. Today, we're going to be talking about politics.
Hooray!
I'm student pastor Maggie Wolford here at Central United Methodist Church in Endicott, New York, and I'm joined by our pastoral leadership team. You want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Pastor Michelle, lead pastor.
And Pastor Paul Reed, associate pastor.
So growing up, I was always told, politics has no place in church, and that in that space, I also saw, both because I was told to see it, but also because, I was paying attention, this really clear through line from the church to the voting booth on conservative issues, people voting for candidates who were anti-abortion, anti-gay marriage. But I didn't see that so often on the progressive side about trying to specifically vote for candidates who, were fighting for marriage equality or for better education or for school lunches or whatever it may be, like these things that are also in a lot of ways the very things that Jesus told us to be doing. So I guess I want to talk with you guys a little bit about that relationship between theology and politics.
For me, through all these, almost 3 decades of ministry, whenever someone has said to me, you are getting too political in the pulpit, you're being political, you're talking politics, you shouldn't be doing that. My first response, and usually I'm pretty good at controlling it and being kind, is to say Jesus was political. I mean, everything Jesus does is political, because every time he talks about his faith tradition, every time he talks about the religious establishment, every time he gets in the face of religious authority, that is the politics of his day.
Right.
And so, yeah, there's no such thing as separation of politics and religion in Jesus' context. And so when we overwrite a 20th, 21st century worldview on that, then of course we have trouble separating that out, or we have a really hard time seeing that as the same thing.
I like Jesus because he was not afraid to upset the apple cart or turn over the table in the temple or whatever. I think part of his mission was certainly to tear apart the system that was there, because the system was oppressive and so many injustices and so many wrongs, and someone had to stand up for it, and he was the person to do that. And that's one of the things that I look at him for, the model of Jesus, for that guidance. So to go after and help fight those oppressions.
Jesus was all about questioning politics, questioning powers and principalities that would do what he saw as antithetical to God's purpose for the world and for creation and for God's people, which is to love each other. And so, yeah, as a pastor in the Christian church, as a preacher of the gospel, I have to say that. People do hear what they want to hear, or what they assume you're trying to say based on your own politics or theology or understandings. And that's true whether it's talking about political things or not. But I think for some of us that cultural is something that you just never talk about politics and religion, right, in polite company. I think Jesus did that all the time. And he brought politics to the people that the system was leaving behind. He said, you're part of God's politics, God's household. This is about you. So Jesus is political in every sense of the word.
Mm-hmm. I think this is one of those things that largely white, evangelical Christians like to do. We like to strip down the idea of Jesus. We tend not to focus so much on the flipping of tables and more on, Jesus the Good Shepherd, who also might have blonde hair and blue eyes, which makes no sense. That ideal of Jesus. Portraying Jesus as not a biblically accurate Jesus in terms of race, characteristics like hair and eye color, that is also in itself political in a lot of ways. Like, you do that with intention.
Well, these days we call it whitewashing.
Yeah.
We make Jesus who we want him to be instead of who the scriptures tell us he is.
Like I said in a previous episode. I was not raised in the church. I went to a Lutheran church a couple times when I was older, and they had the typical long, flowing blonde hair and the blue eyes. And I was like, oh man, Jesus, you're pretty good looking. And in my head, that's who Jesus was until 20 years ago or something. And a former pastor of mine kind of said, hey, by the way, maybe Jesus, because he was born in this area, maybe he's got dark skin, and but it is political, Michelle, like you said, that idea of whitewashing.
The thing about that drives me so crazy is that it is an intentional dismissal of this book that, conservative fundamentalist Christians claim to hold as being literal. And then that idea that you're sort of picking and choosing, or that you're taking things out of this perfect Word of God, that's a criticism that gets leveled at progressive Christians all the time. You're picking and choosing, and you're, portraying Jesus in this way different than he was. Well, I mean, so are most of the paintings hanging up in your churches. It's there are major implications for the way that you are choosing to depict Jesus, both physically, but also in terms of what he's doing. In a lot of those images, he does have flowing hair. He's maybe a shepherd. He's standing on a rock, preaching to the crowds. That's not usually the Jesus you see.
Tame.
Yes.
The tame
Jesus.
Yes.
I'll name that as a difference between conservative or evangelical or fundamentalist Christianity and progressive Christianity, is that progressive Christianity wants to step away from trying to cast Jesus in our own image, and we're more interested in seeing Jesus for who he is and what he represents in his time, and therefore by extension in ours, instead of saying, we want Jesus to be this because that makes us more comfortable. Mm-hmm. If Jesus is peaceful, tame, quiet, doesn't step out of line, mm-hmm. You have a really hard time explaining the crucifixion then. But when we can say, Jesus does turn over tables, Jesus does get angry, Jesus is wrong a couple of times and is corrected. The Samaritan woman is a huge story about that. So I see that as a big difference.
Mm-hmm. This other sort of argument that gets sort of thrown at progressive Christianity a lot is, you profess this Jesus that was fully accepting and fully inclusive, and yet, look at you're saying that we can't be here because we, don't support the LGBT community, or, are fighting to take away people's bodily autonomy, whatever. There's this idea of, I will respect your opinion. We talked about having different opinions about, the creation story. I can respect your difference of opinion so long as that doesn't disrespect someone else's existence. There's a huge difference between, you can say, oh, agree to disagree because, you like chocolate and I don't, or something, but it is not about someone's right to exist as a human, or to love whom they love, or to
everything humans can do.
Yes, to be fully human. So Carlos A. Rodriguez has this quote that Jesus took sides and we should too. And for me, that was like this earth-shattering idea, because again, I had always been sort of thinking that, keep the peace. Don't have a fight. Don't make a stink. Don't whatever. But that only ever benefits oppressors. It doesn't do anything to help people in need. And I think that the story of Jesus shows us these great examples of righteous anger, and it's not something that we're coming up with. It is the example that Jesus set forward.
To go back to something you said earlier about how, I don't remember the exact words that you said, but you saw politics leaving the pulpit, going to the voting booth. Essentially, that's what I heard. Mm-hmm. And I think in my head, the liberal progressive side of Christianity doesn't like to offend. And so I've seen us take a back seat as opposed to the more conservative evangelical, tends to be more oppressive. I think that was the word that we used earlier. I don't know where that fits in this conversation, but that's where I see
I think
us.
that's a factor of whiteness.
And maybe that is. I don't know. But that's where I see us as the church, as the...
Yeah. And it's not just how we think about race and black and white and Asian and all of that. It's a cultural whiteness. It's a cultural standard and expectation of white values, expectations, goals, prejudices that aren't just about race. It's about how we conduct life, how we live with each other. There's a white cultural code there that influences how we do politics and how we see politics in relation to our faith. And we're hearing from communities that are not white communities that it's not just the race thing. We have been too busy being steeped in whiteness that we can't even see that goes beyond race, that the expectations on all of our systems have been whitewashed. And we can't even see Jesus right because of that. It's a cognitive dissonance for folks who have grew up maybe listening to the folks trained that way and now hearing younger, newer generations of pastors with a completely different understanding. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why Christianity, mainline, traditional, denominational Christianity is having such a struggle. And why politics is such a hot issue. Because we're dealing with generational stuff and race stuff and cultural stuff. And all of it around Jesus.
I've been thinking a lot while you were talking about as well that it isn't just race. It's also gender. It's sexuality. It's socioeconomic. It's, there are so many layers to our understanding of Jesus, of God, of what church should and shouldn't be, and of people. I mean, it is just so much. And I wonder if part of the reason, I think you were the one who said this, Paul, that sometimes progressive Christianity can be a little bit, more muted in its political movings, is because we are willing to say, I don't have all the answers. And so some people are very passionate about, racial equality, and some people are very passionate about queer rights, and some people are super passionate about women's rights. But it's different than when our conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical counterparts can sort of rally people under a single umbrella, right, such as let's outlaw gay marriage or let's overturn Roe. I mean, there's power in that, where I think when we get into the progressive sphere, it's like there's a million problems. Everybody sort of break off into the different things that need to be fixed.
Which is exactly what Jesus was railing against, a monolithic understanding of God that was once and for all time. He said, you hear it in his teaching. You have heard it said, do this. But I say, in this new understanding or in a growing understanding of God, I say do this. Mm-hmm. You have heard it said, but I say this. Mm-hmm. And I take a cue from that all of this progresses, all of this changes.
One of my favorite verses comes from Micah, the Hebrew prophet Micah. What does God want us to do? Seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with the Creator. That's it. Seek justice, love mercy, and be humble while you're doing it. I think that's what Jesus was doing, was seeking justice and fighting oppression. Mm-hmm.
I came across Sean Isaac Palmer. He's a minister, and he made this point that I've been thinking about a lot lately. In conservative and evangelical circles, there's a lot of talk about like God is on the throne, mm-hmm, and that God has a plan and everything happens for a reason and all of those things. And so on some level, we can just sort of relax. God's in control. It'll be fine. But the quote he had is, God being on the throne does not permit Christians to rest smugly in privileged peace in the midst of injustice. And the examples he threw out were things like God was on the throne when slavery was a global institution. God was on the throne when women had no rights. God was on the throne when people were being murdered in wars. I mean, that during the Holocaust, during the eradication of Native Americans. I mean, God, you can believe in the power and the authority of God and still say, but here on earth we've got work to do.
That's Jesus. That is Jesus. There is work to do. And he's forever calling, commissioning, and sending people to do God's work. Because it's all of our work.
I do believe that I think there is an ultimate plan. I don't know what it is. So getting back to what you said, that's, the commissioning of the people and the sending out. That's what Jesus said. Go fix those problems. You got to go fix those. You got to. My God doesn't want that to happen. Let's go fix that.
The Jewish tradition calls that tikkun olam, restoring the world. And it is the human task of God's people.
So, as you mentioned, Pastor Michelle, lots of people, politics and religion, they're the things you don't talk about in polite society. And yet, here we are, talking about it. And that there's more conversation to be had. So, for people who do want to go deeper, I mean, really the resource I think about a lot is Carlos A. Rodriguez. I think he does a great job of bringing forward some very progressive voices. I think that he has a wonderful balance between sort of this radical love in his theology while also acknowledging that we need to get out and do the work. But who else would you recommend? What other resources would you point people toward?
I think the work of Sojourners, that's been there for a while, right? They do wonderful work and contribute to the conversation in really powerful and meaningful ways.
There was a book, I don't know the name of the title of the book or the author, but it was Contemporary Theology, and it talked about the feminist theology, the Hispanic theology, the black theology, and that was an interesting way to look at all of these things. And
to hear the different voices, I think, is a huge step. And to listen. To
know there are different voices.
Well, that's the first step.
And then to hear them and then listen to what they're saying.
Yeah.
I think that's, if we don't know there are different voices out there, that's one thing, but we also have to listen and hear them.
All right. Well, till next time. Bye.
Bye.